Tonight, whether the night outside your window is warm and still or cold and blanketed in snow, I'm here with you. No sleigh bells, no reindeer, no sack of toys. Just me, Santa, sitting by the fire with a good story to tell. Because not every night is for delivering gifts. Some nights are meant for remembering. So close your eyes and let me take you back to the year 1379, to a smoky old tavern in York, England, and we'll see it all through the eyes of a boy no one noticed, yet who noticed everything. He cleaned the tables and remembered it all. In the heart of York, during the long winter of 1379, stood a crooked old tavern with walls that leaned like tired men. Its roof sagged beneath the weight of age, and the wooden beams creaked with every gust of wind that slipped through the city's narrow alleys. On some nights, that wind carried snow. On others, it carried damp, cold fog from the ouse. But inside, the tavern, it was always the same, warm in patches, smoky all over, and filled with the thick scent of ale, sweat, and old wood. The boy had already started his work. No one knew his name. They simply called him Boy, if they called him anything at all. At this moment, he was kneeling under the second table near the hearth, scrubbing at something sticky and dark that clung to the floorboards. He didn't ask what it was. In this place, questions only brought trouble. His hands, raw from soap and cold water, worked quickly. He knew the rhythm of the tavern better than anyone. First came the scrape of boots, the slam of the door, and then the barking of orders, usually from Mrs. Drabble, the tavern's owner. A woman as round as a barrel and twice as loud. Her voice could cut through the din of any crowd, and tonight, as always, she was in full command. "Boy! That table better shine before the first drunk lays eyes on it." And so he scrubbed harder. The door groaned open again, and in came the regulars. Tom Five Toes, missing a toe thanks to a pig with poor manners. Jory the chimney sweep, black with soot from forehead to boots. Widow Nan, who drank more than any sailor and had more stories than all of them put together. Martin the cobbler limped in next, his needle still tucked behind his ear. They stomped off snow, unwrapped scarves, and took their seats. No one greeted the boy. They never did. But he watched them all, quietly, carefully. Drunks, he knew, were careless with words, and secrets spilled easily with ale. As the room filled, the noise began to rise. Clinks of mugs, bursts of laughter, the soft thump of boots against wood. The boy wove between tables with his bucket and rag, dodging elbows and boots, catching fragments of conversation. Debts owed, wives scorned, hunts gone wrong. He never interrupted. He simply remembered. Lord Reginald, the tavern cat, made his entrance next. A fat gray creature with a limp and a sense of entitlement. He leapt onto the windowsill, ignoring the boy as he always did, and curled into a ball with a sigh of feline superiority. The patrons liked the cat. Some even brought him scraps. The boy wasn't jealous, not really, just quietly aware that the cat had a name and he did not. Behind the bar, Mrs. Drabble slammed mugs into place and muttered curses under her breath. Her face was already red from the heat of the fire and the pressure of keeping order. She'd once broken a chair over a man's back for insulting her stew. Tonight she seemed calmer, but that could change with one spilled pint. Near the fire, two men began to sing, off-key and loud. The others joined in. The boy knew the tune. He hummed along beneath his breath, careful not to be heard. He didn't belong to the song or the table or the story being told. He belonged to the shadows, to the corners, to the parts of the tavern no one looked at, unless something had gone terribly wrong. A mug shattered against the floor. The singing stopped. Silence swelled for a breath or two. Mrs. Drabble stared hard at the culprit. He raised his hands in apology. No fight tonight. The singing resumed. Outside, snow, or perhaps just cold mist, brushed against the window panes. Inside, the fire crackled softly, but the warmth didn't quite reach the corners where the boy worked. He rubbed his arms, then went back to scrubbing. The rag was damp, the bucket nearly frozen. Still, he continued. A man entered, alone, wearing a cloak too fine for this place. He didn't speak, didn't order, just sat in the back and watched. The boy noticed him, watched him, avoided him. Men like that didn't come to drink. They came for reasons they wouldn't explain. As the night deepened, the air thickened with heat and smoke. The floor turned sticky beneath spilled ale. The laughter got rougher. Voices slurred. The boy kept moving, cleaning, collecting bits of stories no one thought he heard. He stole a glance at the fire. The embers glowed orange, casting dancing shadows against the walls. Somewhere outside, a church bell tolled the hour. But the tavern had no clock. Time passed in songs, in stories, in spilled drinks, and for the boy who cleaned the tables, the night was only beginning. If you ever want to know what kind of man just walked into a tavern, don't look at his clothes. Don't watch his hands. Don't even pay attention to his voice. Smell his breath. The boy had learned that early. Ale left a sharp, sweet tang. The cheap stuff smelled sour, like vinegar left too long in the sun. But there were subtler scents, too. Things only a boy who spent every night scrubbing up the aftermath would learn to recognize. Roasted onions meant a good meal. Smoke meant a long walk from a bad hearth. Blood had its own copper sting. But the worst were the ones that made no sense at all. Perfume, sweat, salt, and once, a man who smelled unmistakably like fish guts and lavender. He didn't ask. Tonight, the smells hit him before the voices did. By the time the second wave of patrons arrived, tired men in half-wet cloaks, cheeks red from cold or beer, the room had begun to stew in itself. The fire only made it worse. It burned low and lazy, not hot enough to clean the air, just enough to swirl the smells together like a cruel sort of broth. The boy moved between tables, breathing shallowly. He had grown skilled at holding his breath for stretches, enough to wipe down a bench, gather empty mugs, and retreat back toward the wash bucket near the hearth. There, he could breathe in the smoke and ash. It was hardly pleasant, but it was familiar. The scent of the fire had its own rhythm. Dry wood popped, damp logs hissed. Sometimes a spark leapt into the air and landed on his shirt. He'd learned not to flinch. Tonight, someone had spilled stew near the door. Not just spilled, dropped the entire bowl. The mess had soaked into the straw floor, mixing with mud from a dozen boots. The boy had tried to mop it up, but the more he wiped, the worse it seemed to get. Mrs. Drabble had taken one look and snapped, "Stop smearing it around like jam on a tart. Get the ash bucket." Ash. The tavern's answer to everything. Sprinkle. It on spilled ale, over vomit, even on greasy tables. It absorbed the worst of the mess, left behind a thin gray trail like a ghost. And it had the added benefit of dulling smells. The boy scattered a handful over the stew mud mixture and watched the liquid vanish into the powder. It wasn't long before a customer complained. "What's that stink?" Mrs. Drabble didn't even turn. "That's the smell of not sitting in someone else's dinner. You're welcome." The boy almost smiled. He returned to his rounds, picking up half-drained mugs, broken crusts, and more than one questionable object that he slipped quietly into a cloth pouch he used for trash. His nose burned. His fingers were numb. He didn't complain. By the hearth, a group of 3 men were arguing over something that had happened at the mill. Their voices rose and fell like waves. One of them slammed a mug down hard enough to spill. The boy moved quickly, wiping the table clean before it stained. "Fast hands," one of them muttered, not unkindly. The boy didn't respond. The fire hissed again, and the boy turned slightly, letting the warmth hit his face. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to sit here, not crouched with a rag, but upright, with a full mug and warm stew. to speak and be answered, to laugh. But the moment passed. A chair scraped. Another mug needed collecting. He moved on. The smells grew worse as the night deepened. Someone had wet themselves in a corner. Another had been sick behind the ale barrels. And always, there was the ever-present stink of sweat and sour breath. The boy no longer gagged, not because it didn't affect him, but because he had trained his body to endure. At one point, he ducked into the small back hallway where the chamber pot was kept. It was dim and damp and usually avoided by everyone, except in dire need. But tonight, it offered a pocket of quiet, and even its foul stench was preferable to the mingled odors of the main room. He crouched for a moment, rubbing his eyes. They burned from smoke. His nose was red, raw from wiping with his sleeve, and his stomach growled, though he ignored it. When he returned to the main room, someone had knocked over a pitcher. A puddle of ale spread across the floor, trickling, into the straw and catching the firelight like melted gold. The boy didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees, rag out, sopping it up before Mrs. Drabble saw. The voices continued, stories, songs, laughter. Somewhere, a man cried, softly, almost too quietly to notice. Somewhere else, a woman screamed with laughter at a joke that had no punchline, and all the while the boy moved between them, silent and invisible. He had begun to recognize certain patterns. Which men would drink quickly and leave? Which ones lingered too long? Which ones tipped? Rarely. And which ones dropped bits of bread or silver for the cat, but never for the boy? He knew who would need help standing, who would fall asleep on the table, who would fight, and who would cry. The tavern was alive in its own strange way. It breathed like a beast with many mouths. It snored, it belched, it swore and sang, and, like all beasts, it stank. But there was something oddly comforting in its predictability. The smells, the messes, the voices, all of it came and went in the same rhythms. And the boy, for all his aches and blisters, understood it better than anyone. Near closing, a fight nearly broke out over a spilled drink. Mrs. Drabble stepped in before fists flew. Her voice cracked like thunder, and the threat of her frying pan did the rest. The tension passed, but not the stink, now tinged with anger and shame. The boy kept scrubbing. When the last mugs had been drained and most patrons had stumbled, out. The boy lit a small tallow candle near the hearth. He didn't need the light, not really. He knew this place in the dark. He took one final lap of the room, wiping down the worst of the spills, collecting scattered crusts, and checking under the benches for anything worth saving. Sometimes there were coins. Once, there had been a ring. Tonight, only a crust of bread. He pocketed it anyway. At last, he knelt near the fire. The embers were dying. Smoke curled up toward the ceiling in thin, lazy lines. The smells were still there, ash, ale, sweat, but now they were fading, melting into the wood. And as he closed his eyes, just for a moment, he imagined a world where air smelled clean, where every room was warm for the right reasons, where he was not the shadow in the corner, but the one the story was about. There were many things the boy feared in the tavern. The stink of the chamber pot on a warm night. The drunk who sang to a knife he kept hidden in his boot. The rats that scurried behind the barrels after midnight. But none of them terrified him. Quite like Mrs. Drabble, she was the tavern's owner, cook, bartender, bouncer, and judge. And she ruled her smoky, battered kingdom with the confidence of a queen and the temper of a bull. People whispered stories about her, though never when she was in earshot. Some said she'd once been married to a butcher and had inherited the tavern after he'd mysteriously slipped into his own sausage grinder. Others said she'd chased off a tax collector with a hot poker. One man claimed to have seen her punch a priest. That one might have been true, but to the boy she was simply the boss, and her favorite tool of enforcement, more fearsome than her voice, more persuasive than her glare, was her frying pan. It hung behind the bar when not in use. Not in the kitchen, mind you, but in full view of the customers. Heavy, blackened with years of soot and stories, its handle wrapped in cloth to hide the scorch marks. She claimed it made better eggs than any pan in York, but mostly it served as a threat. On a good night, it stayed on the hook. On a bad night, it danced. The boy had seen it fly, once when a drunk tried to grope a serving girl, another time when two men began a fight over whose goat had the fattest milk. That time, she hadn't even aimed at their heads. She'd hit the table. The sound alone had made them sit down and apologize to each other like schoolboys. But her fury wasn't limited to customers. The boy had tasted it too. Not in bruises, but in words sharp enough to cut. Use that rag like it owes you money. If I wanted you standing still, I'd stuff you and put you on the mantel. You call that clean? Even the rats would weep. And yet, beneath all that bark, there was something else. Something the boy hadn't quite named. A strange, gruff kind of care that showed itself only in the smallest, most accidental moments. Like the time she shoved half a loaf into his hand after he'd fainted near the fire. She hadn't said a word, just turned away and muttered about how useless boys were without food, or the night she told a customer to pick on someone your own size when he sneered at the boy's patched shirt. That man hadn't come back. The frying pan had made sure of it. The boy had learned how to read her moods. A tight jaw meant danger. A twitch in her left eye meant the stew had burned. When she wiped her hands on her apron twice in a row, she was about to shout. When she wiped them 3 times, she was about to throw something. Tonight she was already simmering. The fire in the kitchen had refused to stay lit. The ale shipment had arrived late, and the baker had brought bread so stale it could be used as roof tiles. "Boy!" she barked. "If that stew boils over again, I'll use you as the mop." The boy nodded and darted into the kitchen, checking the pot like his life depended on it. In some ways it did. The kitchen was hotter than the Tavern. Smoke clung to the ceiling like a bad mood, and the smell of burnt onions hung thick in the air. The stew, thick, brown, and bubbling angrily, hissed at him as he stirred. He wiped his sleeve across his face, then caught himself and used the cloth instead. Mrs. Drabble had once smacked him for smearing sweat into her stew. He hadn't made that mistake again. From the corner of the kitchen, he heard her muttering to herself. "Half the ale's gone, the bread's bricks, and that chimney sweep's dog peed on the mat again." He stayed quiet. Moments later, she stomped in, lifted the lid of the stew, and grunted. "Too thin," she said, tossing in a handful of dried peas. The boy didn't mention that the peas wouldn't cook properly in time. He valued his teeth. Outside, a crash echoed. The unmistakable sound of a mug hitting stone. Someone swore. Mrs. Drabble's eyes narrowed. "Hold this!" she snapped, shoving the ladle into the boy's hands. She was out the door in 2 strides. He heard her voice a moment later, cutting through the tavern like a hot blade through butter. "Which of you wasted good ale on my floor?" The boy stirred in silence. He imagined the frying pan was already in her hands, spinning like a knight's sword. Part of him pitied whoever had knocked that mug over. Minutes passed. She returned, panting slightly, adjusting her apron. "Sorted," she muttered. "No blood this time. Lucky lad." The boy nodded. Then, in a tone softer than expected, she added, "You're doing better with the stew, not burning it as much." It wasn't quite a compliment. But from her, it was as close as he'd ever get. Later that night, when the last customer stumbled out and the candles burned low, Mrs. Drabble leaned against the bar with her arms folded. The boy was sweeping the floor, slow and tired. "You," she said. He looked up. "Don't get any ideas about leaving. You think the other inns would take you? You'd be cat food within a week." He said nothing. Then she added, "But at least I pay you in something warm. That counts for something." She turned and walked away, her heavy boots thudding up the stairs to her tiny loft above the kitchen. The frying pan swayed gently on its hook. The boy stood still a moment longer. Then he returned to sweeping. No one would call what he had a family. But in a tavern that stank of ale and ashes, ruled by a woman with a voice like thunder and a frying pan for justice, it was the closest thing he'd ever known to home. In a tavern like this, there are no strangers, only stories wearing boots. The regulars came not because the ale was good, it wasn't, nor for the food, which was often older than the jokes. They came because the tavern remembered them, held their heat in the benches and their secrets in the walls. And someone like the boy, quiet as candlelight, remembered more than any ledger ever could. He watched from the edges. He scrubbed near their feet. He listened between words, in the silences, in the slips of tongue that only fall when beer is deep and eyes are heavy. And over time he learned something strange. No two regulars were ever just what they appeared to be. There was Tom Five Toes, who had once been Tom Six Toes until a pig took offense to his boot. He swaggered like a man who owned the town, but the boy had seen him flinch at the sound of church bells. Once, when a priest passed by the window, Tom looked away and made the sign of the cross, not out of piety, but guilt. Mrs. Drabble claimed he'd once served a lord, but left with more silver than he should have. Every time someone said the word theft near him, he coughed. Then there was Jurij, the chimney sweep. His face was always streaked black with soot, and his clothes carried the scent of burning wood. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was always in short, clipped phrases, like he'd forgotten how to breathe mid-sentence. One night, someone dropped a spoon, and Jurij jumped as if it had been a sword. The boy never asked why, but after that, he always placed Jurij's drink on the left side of the table, closer to the wall, farther from the door. Still awake, dear listener? Or has my voice begun to soften your thoughts, like warm wool wrapped around your dreams? No matter. I'll keep speaking. I always do. Old Nan was another constant. No one knew her real name. She sat in the same seat every evening, wrapped in layers of cloth, with eyes sharp enough to see through walls. She drank slowly, listened hungrily, and laughed in places where no one else thought to. She said she'd once been a lady-in-waiting, at court, that she'd danced with a prince and stolen secrets from a duke. Most scoffed. But when she described the way silk rustled in winter or the exact pattern of the queen's crest, the boy felt something cold run down his spine. Perhaps she'd once worn jewels. Now she wore wrinkles and stories. There was also the man with gloves who came every Wednesday, sat by the fire, and never removed his hands from the table. He wore a brown coat no matter the season, and always paid with exact change. Never more, never less. He spoke only when ordering and never looked anyone in the eye. Once the boy saw him slip a folded note into the gap behind a cracked brick in the fireplace. The next week, the note was gone, and a different man came in wearing the same gloves. No one spoke of it, not even Mrs. Drabble. And then there was Crate. That wasn't his real name, of course, but he carried crates down by the docks, and the name stuck like a nail in wet wood. Tall, built like a door frame, and always silent. He'd enter without fuss, order a single mug, and sit by the far window. The boy noticed he always looked at reflections, not people. Once, when the tavern was nearly empty, Crate leaned down and said, "You've got good eyes, lad. Keep 'em open, but keep your mouth closed." Then he returned to his mug as if nothing had passed between them. The boy didn't answer. He didn't need to. Still there, child? Or are your eyes drifting like leaves in a slow river? If they are, let them. Santa is still here. The story's not quite done. Mrs. Drabble, of course, had her own rules about seating the regulars. Don't sit Jurij next to the hearth. He sweats like a kettle and smells like one, too. Keep old Nan away from the young ones. She fills their heads with nonsense. And never, never let Crate near the man with gloves. Last time they didn't speak a word, but the silence felt like thunder. The boy followed these rules like gospel, but he had his own, too. He gave Nan a piece of crust when her hands trembled. He brought Jory's drink just the way he liked it, quietly to the side, never with sudden movement. He made sure to sweep the space beneath Crate's table only when Crate had stepped outside, and when the gloved man was near, the boy kept to the corners, never letting his shadow fall across the man's. These little kindnesses weren't noticed. That was the point, and yet, sometimes they were. One evening, Nan winked at him after he folded her napkin just so. Jory once left a copper coin beneath his mug, buried deep, as if it were a secret. Crate nodded more than usual. The boy noticed. He noticed everything. One night, 2 men came who didn't belong. They wore smiles too wide, and their boots were too clean. They asked too many questions about who came when, who paid what, who sat where. They didn't drink. They watched. Later. That night, the gloved man was gone before the boy turned around. The next week, Crate had a bruise on his neck. No one said a word. The boy cleaned spilled ale. He picked up broken glass. He swept under every table like always. But something had shifted. And in that shift, he understood something new. This tavern was not just a place for drinking. It was a place where knowing was dangerous. So he watched. And remembered. And kept his silence. And now, little one, if sleep has taken you, may your dreams be gentle. And if you're still listening, know this. In a world of shouted lies and spilled secrets, sometimes the quietest person in the room knows the most. Some nights in the tavern passed like a slow song. Others crashed through like a drunken horse. Tonight was the second kind. It began with boots, not the usual worn, soft-soled leather of the locals, but heavy things, thick with mud, fresh from the marshes outside York. The boy noticed them first, even before the door finished creaking shut behind them. 3 men, broad-shouldered, red-cheeked, and loud, entered in a flurry of wet wool and careless laughter. Their breath stank of sour cider and spite. Mrs. Drabble spotted them immediately. Her face didn't change, but her grip on the mug she was drying tightened. She said nothing, only nodded toward the far table, the one near the barrel stack. It was a spot reserved for trouble. The boy watched silently from behind the bar. He'd seen men like these before. Not locals, not regulars. Outsiders passing through like storms. They carried the smell of broken fences and bruised ribs, the kind who drank fast, shouted louder, and left wreckage in their wake. Still listening, dear one? I promise this part is short, and Santa will whisper softer after the storm passes. The boy carried a tray of mugs to a nearby table. As he passed the newcomers, one of them stuck out a foot, not quite in his way, but just enough. The boy stepped around it smoothly. No eye contact, no reaction. Fast one, the man chuckled to his mates. Like a mouse in church. The boy moved on. The tavern was already humming before they arrived. Tom Five Toes was arm wrestling a carpenter near the fire. Jory sat in his usual spot, black with soot. Old Nan was nodding off over her mug, her breath steady, her stories spent. Crate was absent. The gloved man hadn't shown in 2 weeks. The newcomers drank quickly. One spilled. His second mug laughed like a donkey and asked for more. Mrs. Drabble sent the boy with a fresh pitcher. As he poured, one of the men leaned close. Too close. You're a quiet one, aren't you? He slurred. The boy didn't answer. You mute? The man asked, louder. Still, no answer. The pitcher emptied. The boy turned to leave. The man grabbed his sleeve. I asked you a question. Now the tavern began to notice. Tom Five Toes stood, stretching his shoulders. Jory's fingers tapped against his mug. Mrs. Drabble leaned forward, both hands on the bar, eyes fixed on the scene. The boy gently pulled his sleeve free. Not hard, not angry. Just quiet. The man didn't like that. With a grunt, he stood and shoved the boy backward. The tray clattered to the floor. A mug rolled, spinning like a coin deciding fate. And then, like thunder from a clear sky, someone punched someone. No one ever remembers who threw the first hit. Maybe it was the drunk. Maybe it was Tom. Maybe fists simply happened when too much ale mixed with too little sense. But in the span of a breath, chairs scraped, mugs flew, and the calm warmth of the tavern burst into chaos. The boy ducked under a table. He'd learned to do that. From beneath the benches, he saw boots stomp, knees buckle, blood drip. One of the newcomers fell hard, clutching his nose, red blooming between his fingers. Another tried to swing a stool, but missed and hit a barrel instead. And through it all, Mrs. Drabble didn't scream. She didn't shout. She reached for her frying pan. The sound of metal against wood rang out like a church bell. One swift swing, clang, and the man holding the stool dropped it, his eyes wide, teeth missing. "Out," she said. Just that, one word, like a spell. And one by one, they staggered out, bleeding, cursing, slipping in their own muddy footprints. When the door slammed shut, the silence left behind was so thick, even the fire dared not crackle. The boy crawled out from under the table, his heart pounding. "Are you still with me, little one? I hope that didn't wake you. But if you're still listening, it's almost over. Santa promises," Mrs. Drabble exhaled sharply, then looked at the mess. "Boy," she said. He met her eyes. "Bucket. Mop. You know the drill." He nodded. Blood had splattered across the floorboards. A stool had cracked clean in half. Someone had lost a tooth. He found it near the hearth, still white, still warm. He wrapped it in cloth and placed it on the bar. Perhaps they'd want it back. The regulars returned to their seats slowly. Tom rubbed his knuckles. Jory lit his pipe. Nan snored softly into her sleeve. The tavern settled like an old dog after a storm. As the boy scrubbed at a red stain near the door, he noticed a boot print in the mud. Not from one of the brawlers. Smaller. Older. From the day before, maybe. Or earlier that evening. He traced it with his finger. Then wiped it clean. By the time the fire had dimmed to coals and the last song had faded, the floor shone. The chairs were upright. The mugs were stacked. The boy, hair damp with sweat and ash on his knees, sat for a moment by the back wall. No one thanked him, but no one needed to. And you, dear listener, if you've stayed this long, your dreams must be near. Let the echoes fade. Let the boots march far away. Tonight there are no more fists, only quiet breath and warm ash. The boy closed his eyes just for a moment, and in that moment, the tavern, battered, bruised but whole, slept too. Every tavern has its routines. The fire is lit before the sun sets. The mugs are rinsed, poorly. The tables wiped, the barrels rolled into place. And when all of that is done, the tavern waits. But on certain evenings, not every night, not by schedule, the door creaks open just after dusk, and the girl with the bread steps inside. She never comes in a hurry. Her boots are always muddy, her shawl frayed at the edges, and her braid, if it can be called that, usually half, undone. But when she enters, something changes. The room doesn't fall silent, but it shifts. A note added to the chord. A gentle pause in the noise. The boy notices first, always. He sees her before anyone else does, because he looks for her. She carries a small basket, its cloth lining faded blue. Inside, round loaves, warm from the oven, smelling of flour and smoke. The bread is never cut. That's for the tavern to decide. Her hands are small, red from cold, calloused from work. She walks with one shoulder slightly higher, from carrying things heavier than a girl her size should. Her name? No one knows. Mrs. Drabble calls her Bread Girl, if she calls her anything at all. Sometimes that baker's daughter. Once, you again. But the boy never calls her anything. He just watches. Still awake, little listener? Or has this soft chapter already begun to lull you towards sleep? If your eyes are heavy, don't worry. Santa will whisper gently. The girl always speaks to Mrs. Drabble first, never long. A few words, a nod. Payment is exchanged in coin, sometimes in barter. Old stew bones for the dog, a scrap of cloth, once even a cracked mirror. The deal is always fast. No time for pleasantries, and yet, when she turns to go, she always glances at the boy. Just once. A look. Not a smile, not quite. But not nothing. He pretends not to notice. Keeps wiping a table that no longer needs wiping. Polishes a mug already dry. One night, it rained hard. The girl arrived soaked, her shawl dripping. She handed over the bread in silence, shivering slightly. As she turned to leave, Mrs. Drabble snorted and tossed her a rag. Dry your hair before. You catch something you can't afford. The girl caught it midair. That night, she lingered a moment longer. Long enough that her eyes met the boy's. They said nothing. But the boy remembered that moment longer than most evenings. Another time? The girl arrived with a scratch on her cheek. Not fresh, but not yet faded. Mrs. Drabble didn't ask. The boy wanted to, but didn't. He simply cleared the path near the door, swept away the mud, and laid a dry plank from the barrel room so she wouldn't slip on the wet stone. She noticed. She stepped carefully. Her foot tapped twice on the plank, a rhythm not quite accidental. Almost a thank you. Are you drifting, dear one? That's all right. This is a quiet part of the story, meant for soft sighs and slow breathing. On one rare evening, the tavern was nearly empty. A sickness had passed through the town that week. Not serious, but enough to keep most locals curled under blankets. The fire burned low, and the only company was old Nan, snoring softly in the corner, and the boy, polishing spoons for no reason at all. That was the night the girl came early. No customers, no Mrs. Drabble. Just the boy, startled, rag in hand. She stood in the doorway, dripping. In her arms, the usual basket, but also something else. A small kitten, soaked and mewling. She didn't speak, just looked at him. The boy, heart pounding, for reasons he didn't understand, pointed toward the hearth. She walked over, set the basket down, then the kitten, then knelt beside the embers. The fire was too weak to dry anything. The boy ran quietly to the back and returned with a scrap of wool and a ladle of warm water from the stew pot. Together, in silence, they dried the kitten. It purred eventually. The girl smiled. Not a big smile, just a flicker, like the edge of dawn. It was the first time he saw her teeth. She didn't stay long. When she left, the kitten stayed. Mrs. Drabble named it Gravy. It lived behind the bar after that. The boy never told anyone about that night. But whenever the kitten curled up near his foot, he remembered. And so, over time, the girl with the bread became more than a routine. She became part of the place, like the cracked beam, near the chimney, or the stool that always wobbled. She came through storm and snow, mud and market day. Always the same basket. Always the same glance. The boy never dared speak to her. But one night, as she left, she dropped something. A crust, perhaps, or a folded scrap of cloth. The boy rushed to pick it up. When he looked up, she was already gone. He unfolded it slowly. Inside, written in crooked letters, "Your mop is too loud." And beneath that, "Thank you for the dry plank." The boy didn't smile, not quite. But the rag in his hand paused, and the warm light of the fire seemed, for a moment, a little warmer. Sleep now, if you wish, little listener. The girl with the bread has gone. But she'll return, just like this story, again and again, with something warm in her hands and something gentle in her eyes, and the boy will be waiting. Some nights in the tavern feel like stories waiting to be told. Others feel like someone dropped a barrel of beer down the stairs and hoped for the best. Tonight was both. It began with an argument, not the loud, dangerous kind that ends in blood and broken noses. No, this was a quieter sort of quarrel, the kind that starts behind the bar between Mrs. Drabble and the delivery boy from the brewery. "The barrels are too warm," she snapped. "They were in the shade," he mumbled, hugging his coat. "The last time they were warm, the foam reached the ceiling and I had to scrub ale out of the rafters. Wasn't me then." Mrs. Drabble narrowed her eyes. The boy, mopping quietly by the fire, paused. He knew that look. It meant trouble was about to ferment. Still awake, little listener? Or has the scent of spilled beer already carried you into dreams? Don't worry. Santa's voice is still here, and this story gets a little messy. The delivery boy left in a hurry, and Mrs. Drabble rolled the new barrel toward the back door with a grunt. "Boy!" she barked. "Get down in the cellar and make space." He obeyed, as always. The cellar wasn't much, just a cramped hole beneath the tavern, with stone walls that wept in the cold, and a ceiling low enough to make taller men duck. The air was always damp, tinged with the scent of earth, old hops, and wood beginning to rot. The boy descended carefully, lantern in one hand. He passed the stack of empty barrels, the shelves of dusty jars, and the crate labeled "Don't Touch" in Mrs. Drabble's handwriting. He didn't touch. He began clearing a space near the back, pushing a leaky keg to one side, brushing away a cobweb with the side of his sleeve. Above, he could hear muffled voices, laughter, the thud of boots. Then, a creak, a groan, and the unmistakable sound of something very large rolling directly above his head. He barely had time to look up. The trapdoor flung open. Light flooded the cellar, and then came the barrel. It dropped like thunder, bounced once on the wooden step, and struck the floor with a sound like a wet explosion. The boy dove left. Too slow. The impact shattered the lid. A geyser of warm, foamy beer shot into the air and splashed in every direction. The lantern flickered. The boy, stunned, sat flat on the stone floor as a wave of ale soaked his tunic and filled his boots. He blinked. The foam rose and kept rising. He scrambled to his feet, slipped, and fell again. The cellar was now a bath, shallow, sticky, and bubbling. Above, Mrs. Drabble shouted, "Boy!" He sputtered. "Here!" "You didn't catch it?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. The beer was rising fast. He climbed the steps and burst through the trap door, soaked from chest to toe, covered in froth. The tavern froze. Every head turned. Even Lord Reginald, the cat, opened one eye. The boy stood in the middle of the room, hair dripping, boots squelching, soaked in barley and shame. Old Nan began to laugh, a slow, wheezing laugh that turned into a full cackle. Then Tom. Then Jurij. Then even Mrs. Drabble, though she tried to hide it behind her apron. The boy said nothing. He just stood there, a statue of ale and foam. Still listening? Or have you already smiled yourself into slumber? Either way, Santa's still here. And there's more. Mrs. Drabble tossed him a towel. "You smell like a tavern floor." He caught it, wiped his face, and began to mop the puddle forming at his feet. But the worst was yet to come. The beer had found the drain, and the drain, as it turned out, hadn't been cleared since midsummer. Within minutes, the kitchen floor began to flood. The pantry was next. A sack of flour fell sideways and burst like a snowstorm. A rat swam for its life. Lord Reginald, disgusted, leapt to the windowsill and refused to move for the rest of the night. The boy mopped and mopped and mopped. By midnight, the foam had faded, the barrels had settled, and the tavern smelled like a brewery on a hot day, which, to be fair, wasn't all that different from normal. Later, when the last patron stumbled out and silence returned, Mrs. Drabble sat heavily on a stool and said, "Well, could have been worse." The boy, wiping ale off a spoon, raised one eyebrow. She shrugged. Could have been red wine. Stains worse. They sat in silence a moment. Then she added, "You all right?" He nodded. She stood, stretched, and reached into her apron. From it, she pulled out a small crust, the end of one of the loaves. "You earned this." He took it. It was still warm. "And now, dear dreamer, if the smell of beer hasn't woken you, may the warmth of bread send you gently back to sleep. This night is over, the cellar drained, the boy, still mopping as always, but even in soaked boots, he had learned something new. Even disasters, if survived, become stories worth remembering. After the bread crust had been handed over and eaten, in 3 careful bites the boy returned to the cellar. The foam had begun to settle, but the floor was still slick. Barrels knocked askew leaned like weary soldiers, and puddles glimmered in the lamplight. He walked carefully, mop in hand, retracing the trail of chaos. Near the back wall, a cork bobbed in the beer like a tiny boat on golden waters. He picked it up, pocketed it. A trophy, perhaps. He worked in silence. The tavern above had quieted. Even Mrs. Drabble's boots had stopped thudding. Outside, the wind pushed gently against the shutters. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then went still. This was his favorite part of the night. No voices, no shouting. Just the hush after havoc. The breath the building seemed to take before sleep. Still there, little listener? Still floating. On this frothy tale? Or have your eyelids begun to sink like barrels into the deep? It's all right. Let go, if you wish. But I'll keep talking, softly, slowly, just in case you're still with me. The boy finished scrubbing the last sticky patch near the wall. He leaned the mop against the barrel marked with a red X, the one that always foamed too early, and sat on the bottom step of the stairs. He pulled off one boot with a schlop, then the other. His feet were pale, wrinkled like old apples. He flexed his toes, then smiled. Just a little. The smile didn't last long. A sound came from the corner. Soft. Quick. Scratch. Scratch. Pause. Scratch again. He froze. The cellar was never truly empty. Slowly, he turned his head. From behind an old crate, a pair of eyes blinked. Back at him. Small, beady, curious. A rat, but not a hungry one, not a bold one, just tired. The boy blinked. The rat blinked back. They stared at each other for a moment. Then, with what could only be described as rat-like resignation, the creature turned and disappeared behind the barrels. The boy sighed. "Me too," he whispered. Upstairs, the fire hissed its final breath. He stood, wiped his feet with a rag, and climbed slowly, carefully, one step at a time. He closed the trap door behind him, and just before he blew out the candle, he looked down at his tunic, still damp, still smelling of barley and yeast. Tomorrow, he'd wash it in the river. Maybe, or maybe he'd let the smell stay a while, let it cling like a badge, because tonight he had faced a flood and lived. In a tavern like this, there were 3 things you learned to accept without complaint: the lice, the rats, and the cat. Let's begin with the lice. No one spoke of them. That was part of the unwritten code of the tavern. Don't mention what's crawling on you unless it bites too hard to ignore. They lived in the seams of old coats, nested in scarf fringe, and made their home in the straw-stuffed benches that no one had dared clean since the Queen's last coronation. The boy had learned to check his sleeves each night. If he forgot, he would know by morning. The itching always started behind the ears, then down the back of the neck. By midday, it spread to the elbows. At first, he tried to wash his tunic daily, scrubbing it in the freezing river behind the bakery. But by the 3rd week, he realized the lice came back faster than he could chase them. so he made peace. He scratched with dignity. And silence. Still awake, little listener? Or has the word lice already lulled you into scratching your own head? Don't worry, we'll move on soon. Santa promises this story will end with something soft. Now, about the rats. They ruled. The cellar. The boy didn't hate them. In fact, he rather respected them. They were quick, clever, and always knew where the crumbs fell. He named the big one Captain Whiskers, a gray beast with one torn ear and a habit of staring at the boy like they shared some ancient secret. Mrs. Drabble declared war on them once, bought traps, set poison, even tried to lure in a stray dog. None of it worked. The rats always came back. They scurried through the cracks behind the pantry. They danced along the beams when the tavern grew quiet. One particularly bold rat stole a strip of bacon directly off a guest's plate. The boy admired that one most of all. Now, the cat, Lord Reginald. He was not noble by blood, but he carried himself like he ruled half of York, large, gray, and entirely uninterested in human affairs unless they involved chicken bones or warm windowsills. He had arrived at the tavern 3 winters ago, strolled in during a snowstorm and sat himself by the hearth. No one questioned it. He had the eyes of something ancient, and from that day on, he belonged to no one, but the tavern belonged to him. He slept through fights. He ignored shouting. Once, someone dropped a full mug on the floor 2 feet from his head. He didn't flinch. He also didn't chase rats. That job, it seemed, was beneath him. The boy had once tried to lift him off a bench to clean beneath. The result was 3 shallow scratches, a bruised pride, and a new rule. Lord Reginald does not move. Ever. Still listening? Or has Lord Reginald already curled up in your thoughts, purring you to sleep? If so, rest easy. But if you're still here, let me tell you what happened one curious night. The boy had finished his chores early. It was rare. No spilled stew, no broken mugs, and only one minor fight, handled swiftly by Mrs. Drabble's frying pan. So, with time to spare, he sat near the hearth, wiping crumbs from a plate and watching the cat. Lord Reginald was stretched, across a bench, belly exposed, purring softly. The boy envied that purr. It was the sound of someone who had never cleaned vomit with a rag or been blamed for an overturned keg. Then he noticed something strange. Captain Whiskers, the bold rat, was creeping along the floor, heading straight toward Lord Reginald's bench. The boy held his breath. Closer, closer. The rat paused. The cat opened one eye. The rat froze. The cat closed the eye. The rat continued, and then, with all the gall of a noble thief, the rat climbed onto the bench, sniffed the edge of Lord Reginald's tail, and fell asleep on the same bench, right next to the cat. The boy stared. Well now, he thought, that's new. He didn't tell Mrs. Drabble. Some secrets, after all, are too strange to explain. From that night on, the boy noticed it again. Not always. The same rat. But now and then, when the tavern had gone quiet, a small shape would curl up near the great gray cat. Not touching. Not quite. But close enough to feel safe. And Lord Reginald? He never moved. Maybe, the boy thought, even a creature who claws for warmth can sometimes share it. Still awake, dreamer? If your lids are heavy, let them fall. If your head is warm, thank the cat. He's a good one, even if he won't chase the rats. By the end of the week, the boy had his own corner near the fire. Not a bench, not a cushion, just a patch of floor beside the wall where the heat reached. But the draft didn't bite. He curled there sometimes between wiping down mugs and clearing crumbs. One night, as he rested there, a soft weight settled on his feet. He opened his eyes. Lord Reginald, the cat, lay there, eyes half-lidded, tail flicking once. The boy didn't move. He didn't dare. And in that moment, with lice behind his ears, rats beneath the floor, and a cat purring on his toes, he felt more comfort than he had in weeks. Because warmth is not always clean, and safety is not always silent. Sometimes it's a quiet room, a still fire, and the weight of something soft and breathing at your feet. He stayed like that for a long time, not asleep, not awake, just breathing, eyes half open, feeling the slow, steady weight of the cat on his ankles. The room was silent, save for the occasional snap from the hearth. The benches were empty now. The last mug had been washed. Even the rats, for once, kept to themselves. It was a strange kind of peace, not joy, not happiness, but a soft, stubborn kind of okay, the kind only the very tired understand. Lord Reginald shifted slightly. The boy thought he might rise, but instead the cat curled more tightly, tucking his tail around the boy's foot like a ribbon. In the dark, the boy smiled, and just then, as if the night had one last odd gift to give, the door creaked. It didn't open. No wind, no visitor. Just a creak. He sat up slightly. Lord Reginald blinked, unimpressed. From beneath the table, something rustled. The boy held his breath. A small rat, not Captain Whiskers, scurried into view, thin, cautious pink tail dragging like a thread behind. It didn't run toward the kitchen, or the pantry, or the stairs. It ran toward the hearth, toward the boy. He didn't move. It stopped beside his knee, sniffed. He stayed perfectly still. The rat looked at the cat. The cat looked at nothing. Then, unbelievably, the rat crawled beneath the hem of the boy's cloak and curled up, right there, between cloth and skin, seeking warmth, perhaps, or safety. The boy looked at Lord Reginald. The cat blinked once, yawned, and closed his eyes again. No judgment, just acceptance. The boy didn't chase the rat away. What would be the point? Everything in the tavern shared space, fleas and firelight, blood and bread, beasts and boys. There were no neat boundaries, no clean corners. There was only this, a roof, a floor, a place to sleep. And if you were lucky, something warm curled at your feet or in your cloak. And now, dear one, if you're still here, still listening, let Santa say this. Sometimes the world outside demands neatness, manners, silence. But the tavern asks only one thing. Can you endure the night? If the answer is yes, then you belong. The boy, with a rat beneath his cloak and a cat atop his toes, closed his eyes. He didn't sleep. Not yet. But for the first time in days, he rested. Some nights in the tavern were louder than others, not because of fights, not because of storms, but because of songs. It didn't take much to start them. A second mug, maybe a third. A story half true told too proudly. A memory, a dare, a tune, hummed out of boredom. And suddenly, the tavern would lift its voice like a drunken choir with no conductor and no shame. Voices cracked. Keys were missed. Lyrics were mangled beyond recognition. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the rhythm, the pounding of fists on tables, the sloshing of ale in mugs, the way even the broken men, even the bitter ones, seemed to remember joy just for a moment. The boy knew all the songs. He knew the old ones, the bawdy ones, the sad ones. He knew the verses that were whispered and the ones that were roared. He knew which choruses would make Nan cry and which ones made Tom slap the table until the mugs danced. He knew them because he'd heard them 1,000 times. But he had never sung a word. Still with me, little listener? Or has your mind already drifted into lullaby and shadow? If so, rest easy. But if you're still here, I'll keep going, soft as the second verse of a sailor's song. The boy's lips never moved. Even when the room shook with voices, he remained silent. Not because he didn't want to sing. Not exactly. But no one had ever asked him to. He moved between tables with his rag and his bucket. He dodged stomping boots and swaying shoulders. Once, a man clapped him on the back and said, "Sing, boy." But it was a joke, a dare. Laughter followed before he could even open his mouth. So he didn't. Instead, he listened, collected the melodies like coins, stored the verses in the corners of his mind like scraps for a winter fire. Some songs were sharp, filled with marching drums and battle cries. Others were soft, about lost lovers or fields of wheat that never grew right. Some were nonsense, drunken rhymes about frogs in boots and ladies with 3 husbands. And some were stories, long, winding things that changed with each singer. The boy liked the story songs best. There was one about a girl who turned into a swan, another about a knight who fell asleep in a forest and woke up 100 years later. He didn't know if they were true, but they felt true when sung. There was one song, an old, slow one, that made Mrs. Drabble go quiet every time. The moment the first note was sung, she would stop wiping the bar. Her hands would still, her eyes would lower, and for that short span of music, she looked like someone else entirely. The boy never asked her why, but he remembered the tune. Every note. Still awake? Or has the song already pulled you into slumber? That's all right. I'll keep it gentle. One night, the tavern was especially full. It was a feast day, something to do with saints or kings or victory over someone no one remembered. But the ale was cheap, and the songs were loud. The boy weaved between the crowd, wiping where he could, dodging what he couldn't. A man in a green coat spilled half a pint on his foot and shouted a cheer about it. A woman jumped on a table and began to sing a verse the boy had never heard. Others joined in by the 3rd line, and then, suddenly, they were all singing. One voice became 5. 5 became 15. And soon the whole tavern swayed with the melody. Even Lord Reginald, sleeping on the windowsill, twitched an ear. The boy stood still. He knew this song. He knew every word, but something in the air, the weight of it, the warmth, made his chest feel tight. He opened his mouth, just a little, not to sing, not yet, just to feel the shape of the sound. And then, someone shouted, a mug fell, the moment passed. The boy turned back to his work. Later that night, as the fire dimmed and the voices faded, he sat near the hearth and hummed. Not loudly, not for anyone, just for himself. A scrap of a verse, a few quiet notes, enough to remember that his voice still worked, and that, perhaps one day he might sing, still listening, just a little longer. One evening, long after the songs had died down and the patrons had stumbled home, Mrs. Drabble stood by the bar. The boy was sweeping. She said nothing for a long time. Then, without looking at him, she muttered, "You know them all, don't you?" He blinked. She glanced sideways. "The songs?" He nodded. She snorted. "Knew it. One day you'll sing 'em better than this whole room of braying fools." And just like that, she turned and went upstairs. The boy stood still a moment. Then, with no one watching, he whispered the last line of that old, slow song, the one that made even Mrs. Drabble stop wiping the bar. And for that moment, it echoed, just for him, and maybe, just maybe, for someone listening in the dark. It didn't matter how loud the tavern was, how many mugs were raised in song, how many boots pounded the floor in some clumsy attempt at dancing, how many voices filled the rafters with tales both real and ridiculous. When the taxman walked in, all of it stopped. The silence didn't fall like a hammer. It seeped in, quiet as winter fog. A hush born not of fear, but something colder. The kind of stillness that reminded you money was never really yours, only borrowed until someone, in darker clothes and cleaner gloves, came to take it back. The boy didn't hear the taxman enter. He felt it. A stillness behind him that made him pause mid-wipe at a table near the window. The hair on his neck lifted. He turned slowly. There he was. Tall. Too tall, it seemed, for the low beams of the old tavern. Cloak black as ink. Gloves that didn't flex. Hat with a brim that cast shadow across a face no one wanted to remember. He didn't stomp or clomp. He simply arrived, like the end of a sentence. Mrs. Drabble didn't greet him. She didn't need to. Everyone knew why he came. Taxes weren't due every week, but when he showed up, the pouch had better be ready. She reached under the bar. With a grunt, produced a small cloth bundle tied tight with string and placed it on the counter like it might bite her. The taxman didn't speak. He simply untied it. One finger, gloved of course, pushed the coins into neat little piles. The tavern held its breath. Even Nan, who never stopped mumbling even in her sleep, sat with her lips pressed thin. Jurij cleaned his pipe so slowly it barely made sound. Tom blinked like he'd forgotten how. Lord Reginald, the cat, didn't stir, but his tail flicked once. The boy watched from the edge of the room, rag in hand, unsure if he should keep wiping, or pretend he didn't exist. Then came Mrs. Drabble's voice, not loud, not soft. "Chair," she said, not to the taxman, to the boy. That was all. He nodded, found the cleanest stool, wiped it twice, carried it over, careful not to let the legs drag, set it beside the man. The taxman didn't sit. He nodded once, if you could call that a nod, and continued counting. It wasn't just coin he counted. That much was clear. He was listening too. The boy realized it then. The man was taking measure of the quiet, of the air, of how quickly people stopped smiling when he entered a room. And he was satisfied. That was the worst part. When he finished, he retied the pouch, gave Mrs. Drabble a curt nod, and turned without a word. But not before his eyes, gray, still, like river stones, landed on the boy. For only a second. Just long enough to make the boy wonder how someone could look at you like they were measuring your worth in weight, not words. The door creaked open. A gust of cold slipped in. Then it shut, and the sound returned slowly, like breath after a nightmare. A cough, a chair scraping, someone whispering too loud. Mrs. Drabble let out a long sigh and muttered, "Drinks on the house." That never happened. The boy resumed cleaning, wiped a table that had already been wiped, picked up a mug that wasn't empty, just something to do with his hands. Later that night, when only the fire crackled and the shadows stretched, long across the floor, Mrs. Drabble stayed by the bar longer than usual. She didn't speak at first, just wiped the same spot on the counter over and over. Finally, she said, "He collects more than taxes, that one." The boy paused. She looked toward the hearth, not at him. Takes the noise out of a place. The color, like wringing a rag dry. You ever seen a man take joy like that before? He hadn't, but he'd felt it. In the way the room changed. In the way even the regulars sat like children waiting to be told they'd done something wrong. She added, "He's not the worst of them, but he's the quietest, and that boy is worse than shouting." Then she retired upstairs, the floor creaking beneath her boots. The boy sat by the fire, rag across his lap. The flames danced in half-hearted rhythm. The room was warm, but the warmth didn't reach his chest. He thought of the chair, the one he'd placed, empty. He thought of the man's eyes, cold, calculating, curious in a way that made you want to look away but couldn't. He remembered the silence, not the kind you get at the end of a song or after a story. This silence was heavier, thicker, like walking through fog that pressed back. Even Lord Reginald curled up tighter than usual. The boy hummed to himself, just one note, a test. The note died before it reached the beams. That night, even sound was shy. He eventually climbed to the cot in the back, behind the barrel stack, and laid down without changing. The rag still in his hand. The warmth of the fire didn't follow him. But he didn't shiver. He just stared at the ceiling, where the lines in the old wood looked like rivers with nowhere to go. Maybe, he thought, silence is what's left when everything else has been spent. Like coin, like voice, like hope. And in a tavern where people came to forget the world, the taxman came to remind them that the world was still very much watching. When sleep finally came, it came without dreams, just quiet, and the faint echo of a door that never truly closed. He came in just after the fire had been stoked and the first mugs had begun to sweat. Not with the regulars, not with the traveling merchants or dock hands. No. He arrived alone, with a flourish, like a gust of wind that wanted to be noticed. His cloak was long, though frayed near the hem. His boots, once fine, now dulled with dust. On his hip hung a sword, not shining, not clean, but there nonetheless. And on his face the look of a man used to being listened to, or pretending he was. The boy noticed him right away. How could he not? The man announced himself before a single word was spoken. The room quieted, not in fear like with the taxman, but in curiosity. Strangers were common in the tavern, but not ones who carried themselves like fallen statues. "I am Sir Corwin of Westmere," the man said, as if everyone had been waiting for his name all evening. No one had. But no one interrupted either, not even Mrs. Drabble. She raised an eyebrow, then gestured toward an empty table. He took it like a throne. "Ale," he ordered, "and meat, something roasted. I've known nothing but hard bread and cold steel these past weeks." Mrs. Drabble snorted but didn't argue. She had a nose for trouble but also for stories, and this one looked like it might offer a tale worth overhearing, or at least enough coin to pay for the effort. The boy brought the mug. The man took it like a hero drinks after battle. The way his hand trembled betrayed the hunger he tried to hide. The food followed, stew and bread, not the roast he'd imagined. And he ate like a man who hadn't tasted warmth in days. And then, once full, he began. "The Battle of Windmere was colder than you'd believe," he said. "Fog so thick you could lose your brother 5 feet away. And still, we marched. Armor froze to skin. I lost 3 men to frostbite before steel ever touched steel. But we held. We always held." The regulars leaned in, not because they believed him, but because belief wasn't required for a good story. The boy kept moving, wiping, listening. He had heard better tales, but rarely ones told with such desperate conviction. Sir Corwin spoke of dragons, seen but never slain, of queens in towers, rescued but unnamed, of a war that may have happened, or perhaps only in his head. He laughed too loud at his own jokes, paused too long after each dramatic line, and through it all, he drank. When the second mug was empty, he asked for a third. "Put it on the honor of Westmere," he said with a wink. Mrs. Drabble's expression did not change, but she poured. The boy brought it, and still the knight spoke. "They say chivalry is dead," he muttered later, cheeks pink from ale. "But not in me. No, never in me." When he leaned back, hands on belly, eyes glazed, he let out a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere older than him. "A man must be remembered," he said to no one in particular. "What else is there?" The boy was the one who cleared the plates, lifted the half-eaten bread, the bones sucked clean, the mug with foam drying at the edges. The knight sat still, eyes half closed, mumbling now about fields and fallen banners. "Payment," Mrs. Drabble said finally. Her voice was not harsh, but it was not a question. The knight blinked, patted one pocket, then another. He stood, swayed, reached into his cloak. The room tensed, not in fear of a blade, but something worse. Embarrassment. He pulled something out. A small silver spoon, shined, engraved. "This," he said, holding, "Adhai is from the Duke of Erlin's own estate, taken during a feast in his honor, a memory of service." Mrs. Drabble stared at it, then stared at him. "You stole it," she said flatly. "Borrowed," he corrected, "until fortune returns." She didn't answer, just nodded at the boy, who took the spoon, and the knight, as if that settled everything, adjusted his cloak and walked out. No one stopped him, not out of kindness, but because men like that didn't need stopping. The world would catch up with them eventually. The door creaked shut behind him. The room exhaled. "Another one," Nan muttered. "Swore he rode with the Black Guard last time, then it was the Queen's own." "Probably sold that sword. For soup," Jory said. "Bet it's wood." The laughter that followed was soft, sad, familiar. The boy turned the spoon over in his hands. It was real silver, cold, engraved with a crest no one recognized. He placed it behind the bar. Mrs. Drabble didn't touch it. "We'll melt it," she said eventually. "Someday." That night, as the fire dimmed and the chairs were turned upside down, the boy wiped the table where Sir Corwin had sat. There was a crumb in the shape of a shield. He flicked it away. Lord Reginald watched from the window. Outside, the wind howled softly, the kind of wind that carried voices away before they could become echoes, the kind that swept up names no one remembered. And somewhere out there, a man in a frayed cloak and empty purse was likely spinning another tale in another tavern to another crowd, and maybe they'd believe him. Or maybe, like here, they'd simply let him talk. Because sometimes, that's all a man has left. A voice, a spoon, a memory he never really owned. The boy didn't judge him. He had seen worse, and he had learned that in taverns like this, you didn't need truth to be heard, only confidence, and something shiny to leave behind. It started, as most things in a tavern do, with something small, a smell. Not the usual sour tang of ale or the thick comfort of stew bubbling too long. This was sharper, darker. It clung to the back of the throat. The boy noticed it first. He was wiping down the corner of a sticky table, half listening to the rhythmic clack of old Nan tapping her mug, when something in the air shifted. He paused, sniffed, and frowned. It was faint, but wrong. A sourness underneath the wood smoke. He looked up just as a thin line of gray curled out from beneath the kitchen door. Then came the sound. A pop like an angry breath. And then a crack like a bone snapping. "Boy!" Mrs. Drabble's voice came sharp fast. "Bucket! Now!" He ran before his feet even registered the command. Past Jory's startled expression, past the snoring sailor slumped near the hearth. The kitchen door swung open and heat hit him like a slap. Inside, the air was thicker, heavier. The oven glowed far too bright, angry red around its seams. And beside it, where kindling was stacked too high and too dry, a lick of flame danced across the edge of a splintered crate. The boy grabbed the water bucket by the door, but it was nearly empty. Mrs. Drabble was already beating at the kindling with a burlap sack, face glistening with sweat. "The rain barrel!" she barked. "Out back! Move!" He ran again, shoving, opened the back door. The cold hit like a gasp. Outside, the rain barrel sat beneath the overhang, half full, water sloshing with his movement as he plunged the bucket deep. His hands stung with cold, but he didn't hesitate. Water spilled over his boots as he turned and dashed back inside, the handle biting into his palms. He didn't feel it. The kitchen was louder now. The crate had fully caught. The flame had reached the curtain hung between the rear pantry and the baking area, and that thin cloth was already crackling as black spread up its center like ink in water. He threw the first bucket hard, the water slapping against the base of the fire, and sending up a shriek of steam that blinded him. Heat surged, smoke ballooned toward the ceiling. Coughing, he backed into the doorway, blinking furiously. Mrs. Drabble grabbed a pan, not her frying one, but a deep iron pot, and scooped stew water from the cauldron, flinging it in wide arcs. "Get more," she ordered. "Keep moving, or we'll lose the whole bloody wall." Again he ran, slipped once on the slick stone, caught himself, filled the bucket again. Inside, someone had opened the tavern door and smoke was billowing into the front room. Shouts erupted. A few customers rushed out. A mug shattered. The boy returned just as Mrs. Drabble was yanking down the burning curtain with a long hook, stomping at the embers with a burlap sack soaked in dishwater. He poured again, directly onto the blackening floor. The flames hissed and spit, but the worst was already retreating. Steam wrapped around them like fog. Then, suddenly, it was quiet. The glow had dulled. The walls smoked, but no longer burned. The crate was gone, the curtain a sodden mess. Mrs. Drabble stood with her hands on her knees, breathing hard. Her hair was soaked. Soot streaked her cheeks. The boy sat down hard on the floor, chest heaving. The mop, discarded beside the water bucket, steamed gently. A moment passed. 2. Then she looked at him and said, "Well, we've had worse." He looked down. The cuff of his tunic was black and curling. His eyebrows felt suspiciously uneven. "I think I lost one," he muttered. She squinted. "Just the left, it'll grow." In the front room, someone clapped, lightly like a hesitant raindrop. Then another joined, then a few more. Not for celebration, but recognition. They had seen the smoke, heard the shouts, and now, seeing the two of them standing amid ruin but not ashes, they offered what little they could. Mrs. Drabble rolled her eyes, but didn't stop them. The boy flushed, not sure if it was from heat or embarrassment. When the tavern had calmed, and the guests returned to their mugs and murmurs, the boy and Mrs. Drabble remained in the kitchen, wiping black from the walls, dragging out the remains of the curtain. The pantry was scorched along its bottom edge. A jar of onions had burst from heat. The floor was slick and hot and smelled of old stew and wet wood. "Tomorrow," she muttered, "I'll get a new crate and move it farther from the damn oven." The boy didn't answer. He was scrubbing the soot where the wall met the shelf, watching it smear like charcoal across the rag. He didn't stop until the cloth came away gray instead of black. That night, when all had settled and the last chair had been turned upside down, the boy sat by the hearth now glowing soft with embers. He sipped warm broth from a chipped mug, the only thing salvageable from the pot. Mrs. Drabble joined him, setting a slice of bread on the table. It was burnt on one edge. "Eat around it," she said. "Or don't. I'm not your mother." He smiled for the first time in hours. Lord Reginald jumped onto the bench beside him, sniffed at the smoke, then curled up without comment. The boy leaned back, stared at the ceiling. "Do you think," he asked, "it would have taken the whole tavern?" Mrs. Drabble didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Maybe, if we hadn't moved." He thought about that, about the fire, about the breathless panic, about the moment the curtain flared up and his feet had frozen. But he'd run anyway. Afterward, he'd run again. That counted, didn't it? She added more quietly, "You moved fast. Good instincts. That matters more than courage." He didn't reply. Just let the warmth from the fire sink into his knees. The room was quiet again. Safe. For now. And tomorrow there'd be a new curtain, a cleaner wall, and most likely another bucket left just a bit too far from the oven. But for tonight, they had won. Not grandly, not loudly, but they had won. And in this tavern, that was enough. He came in late. Later than most. The kind of late where even the rats have gone quiet and the fire has sunk into its own silence. The boy was almost done for the night, just wiping down the last table near the hearth, when the door creaked open. and let in the cold along with a man who looked like he'd been walking for 100 years. He wore no cloak, only a threadbare coat buttoned wrong, and his shoes were soaked through. He didn't speak as he crossed the room, just nodded once at Mrs. Drabble, who raised a brow and poured a mug before he even asked. She didn't charge. Him. Not that night. He took a corner seat, not quite in the shadows, but not in the light either. His beard was scraggly, his eyes glassy but not wild, and when he lifted the mug, he cradled it like something delicate, like a secret he couldn't bear to spill. The boy watched him because there was nothing else left to watch. No more guests, no more noise, just the sound of that one man breathing into his cup. Still with me, little listener? If your eyes are heavy, let them close. But stay a little longer, because this isn't a story with shouting. It's a story with remembering. After his first drink, the man let out a sigh that seemed to carry 100 winters. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. Not to anyone in particular, just to the air. He was just a boy, he said. The boy, the real one, the one with the rag in his hand and sore feet, paused. The drunk wasn't looking at him, wasn't looking at anyone, just into the flames. Had hair like mine back then, the man went on. Too light? Burned in the sun? Ran like the wind? Never walked if he could climb? You know the kind. The boy didn't answer, but something in him leaned forward, just a little. He used to follow me around, the man said, like a shadow that laughed, always asking questions, always hungry. Gods he could eat. I'd save crusts for him, tell him they were treasure. He believed it, every time. He drank again. Slower now. One winter he got sick. The kind of sick you don't fight off. We didn't have coin for the good herbs, just hot rags and hope. He stopped then, rubbed his eye with the back of his sleeve. I wasn't there when he went. I was out, trying to get work, carrying crates, hands bleeding, trying to make enough to buy him a blanket. By the time I got back, he was already cold. The tavern didn't make a sound. Even the fire held still. The man stared into his mug. That's what I remember, he said. The cold, and how quiet the house was after, like it had forgotten how to echo. He didn't cry. Not really. But his shoulders shook once, like something inside him shifted and couldn't shift back. The boy realized his hands were still. He hadn't wiped the table in minutes. Just stood there, listening, breathing shallow. The man raised his eyes then, just for a second. They met the boy's, and for that moment, he wasn't drunk. He wasn't slurring. He was just a man who had lost something. You look like him, he whispered. Only thinner. He hated washing, too. The boy almost smiled, but it didn't reach his face. Mrs. Drabble walked over then, slow and careful, and placed another mug beside him. Still no charge, no comment, just presence. The man nodded once, grateful, drank again. You keep running, he said, more, to himself than anyone. You think if you keep moving, the memory can't catch you. But it's clever. It waits, follows, sleeps when you sleep, wakes when you laugh. He leaned back. The firelight caught in his eyes. And some nights when you've had enough ale and not enough sleep, it finds its way into your mouth. Comes out like a story, and then someone else has to carry it. The boy swallowed. He didn't know why, but he felt heavier, as if the man had handed him something invisible but real. A bundle of grief wrapped in quiet words. You'll remember this someday, the man said, already drifting into that space between sleep and sorrow. Not the names, not the place, but the feeling, the weight of it. You'll carry it. And that'll mean he's not all gone. The boy didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Just folded his rag over the edge of the table. The man fell asleep soon after, head on his arms, breathing soft, no snore. Just the slow rhythm of someone who had nothing left to run from, not that night. Mrs. Drabble covered him with a spare blanket from the back, said nothing. The boy sat by the fire, knees pulled to his chest. He didn't sleep. Not yet. He watched. The flames move and tried to picture the boy the man had lost. Blonde hair, fast feet, big appetite. He tried to picture himself in that house, hearing the silence that forgets how to echo. And for the first time in a long while, he wondered what his own silence sounded like. Not the quiet of not speaking, but the quiet of not being asked, not being missed, not being remembered. Still awake, little one? Then let this be your story, to carry to. A story not of heroes or kings or battles won, but of a man, a boy, and a fire, and a grief too tired to cry. Sleep now if you can, and if you can't, that's all right. Sometimes the weight is too fresh, but you're not carrying it alone. The tavern had emptied hours ago. The mugs were dry. The candles had melted down to pools of wax hardened along the rim. The fire was ash now, dim orange flakes barely clinging to the embers. Most would have left it at that, but the boy never did. Not because he was told to, because the floor never really looked clean unless you scrubbed it after the voices stopped. That was when the truth showed up, in the quiet, when the woods stopped hiding behind shadows and sound. The mop was old. The bucket was dented. But both knew the floor like a priest knows his altar. Every warped plank, every groove worn down by boots and broken chairs. He dipped the cloth in water gone cold, wrung it half-heartedly, and knelt. The rag hit the floor with a soft slap. He began in the corner, the one by the hearth where old Nan sat every night, tapping her mug and muttering stories no one asked for, but everyone somehow missed when she fell asleep too early. That corner held old stew stains, bits of wax, and a dried patch from when Jurij knocked over a bottle 2 nights ago. The boy pressed the rag into it. The wood groaned. He pushed harder. Still listening, little one? If your limbs are heavy, let them rest. But if you're still here, I'll keep speaking us, because someone has to remember what quiet work sounds like. He moved in slow circles. Scrub, rinse, wring, repeat. The cloth came up dark. The stain lightened. Not gone. Never gone. Just faded. That's all scrubbing really does. It doesn't erase. It just makes forgetting easier. He worked his way across the floor, silent but for the soft rasp of wet fabric on wood. Near the bar, a sticky patch from spilled ale fought back. He pressed harder. The wood darkened under pressure, not from water, from wear, and from stories no one told out loud. There was a place near the window that always smelled faintly of vinegar. Someone had been sick, there long ago. No one remembered who. But the scent remained like a ghost too polite to ask for attention. The boy paused, leaned back, wiped his brow. His arms ached, but not enough to stop. Pain wasn't new. What was new was the silence, the kind that settled deep into the beams, the kind that creaked just once to remind you it was listening. Mrs. Drabble had long since gone upstairs. Lord Reginald lay curled on the bar, tail twitching in some dream that involved neither cleaning nor caring. The boy kept scrubbing, because no one else would, and because the floor didn't lie to him. It didn't pretend he was more important than he was, but it also didn't ignore him. It simply accepted the press of his hand, the weight of his effort, the rag soaked with yesterday's mistakes. Near the pantry, he found something strange. A coin. Not a real one. Too light, too smooth. A token, perhaps. From another town, another tavern, another man who didn't finish his story. He pocketed it without looking. Just a small addition to the collection of things no one else saw. The cloth began to fray at the edge. Threads pulled loose. Still, he scrubbed. By the back wall, the wood was older, softer. Each wipe left a faint mark. He tried to be gentle, but the dirt here was stubborn, thick with months of boots and mugs and secrets spilled too quietly to hear. He pressed. The rag squeaked. The grain bent. A sliver came loose and stuck into his palm. He didn't flinch, just sucked in his breath and pulled it out. A small dot of blood appeared. He wiped it on his sleeve, then kept going. Because sometimes cleaning isn't about making something new. It's about proving that you were here, that your hands touched, something real, and that even if no one noticed, the floor would remember. Are you drifting, dear dreamer? Let this be the part that settles you. Let your breath match the rhythm of cloth on plank. Let your thoughts slow like water cooling in a bucket. At the center of the room, the boy sat back on his heels, looked at the space he'd just finished. It gleamed, not brightly, but with the dull sheen of something tended to, something tried for. And that mattered, more than anyone said aloud. He stood, stretched, wiped the back of his neck. His knees popped. The mop leaned against the far wall like an old friend too tired to say goodnight. He poured the dirty water into the trough behind the tavern, where it joined the slow trickle leading down into the street. Then he returned, sat at the edge of the hearth, took off his boots. His socks were damp. He didn't mind. Across the room, the floor shone just enough to catch the light from the last candle still burning, a golden streak across weathered brown. He smiled. Not big, not proud, just satisfied. For tonight, that was enough. He laid down then, just beside the coals, curled into himself. No blanket, no words, just the scent of soap and ash, and the warmth of a floor that, in its own way, had listened. Sleep now, little one. The night is deep. The work is done. The wood is clean, or clean enough. And if it bleeds a little when you scrub, well, that just means it remembers too. This was the hour no one spoke of. The hour after the last chair had been turned upside down. After the last guest had staggered home. After even Mrs. Drabble had climbed the stairs, boots heavy on the old steps, door creaking shut behind her. The boy called it the hour of rats and echoes, because that's what was left. Sounds that didn't belong to anyone, and small lives that didn't need permission to run. He lay on his side by the hearth, not quite asleep, not quite awake. The fire had fallen to embers, soft and red like sleeping coals. Shadows stretched long across the floor. The mop rested beside the bar. The bucket had been emptied, but the scent of soap and smoke still lingered in the air like a story that forgot its ending. Then came the first rustle, a soft scurry behind the pantry door, then another from the beams above. The rats were out, bold now, confident. This was their time. The boy didn't move. He'd learned long ago that the rats didn't care if you watched, only if you chased. Tonight he wasn't chasing, just listening. One of them, Captain Whiskers probably, darted across the room, paused near the salt barrel, sniffed, then vanished beneath a bench. Another crept along the shelf where the bread used to sit. It stood on its hind legs, peered at the moonlight through the window, then turned back into the shadows. The tavern creaked, not in fear, in memory, old wood remembering old weight. Conversations sunk into its grain, laughter, shouts, arguments about coin, apologies never said aloud. They echoed now, not as sound, but as space. The boy could feel them more than hear them. Ghosts not of people, but of moments. A boot step that never landed. A song that hadn't been sung in months. The sigh of someone who once sat alone and didn't mind it. Still awake, little dreamer? Or have the echoes already folded into your breath? It's all right if they have, but stay a little longer if you wish. The boy's eyes stayed open. He watched the ceiling. The beams ran like ribs across the tavern's chest. He sometimes imagined the building as a creature breathing through the cracks, heartbeat slow and steady through the floor. He liked thinking that he wasn't alone, even when the people were gone, that something bigger than him was keeping watch. The rats grew braver. One climbed a stool, another crossed the hearthstones. Lord Reginald lifted his head from his curled position on the bar. His ears twitched. He made a low, unbothered sound and went back to sleep. No threat tonight, no hunt, only coexistence. The boy listened to it all. The scratch of claws on wood, the tap of something falling. A crumb, maybe. The breeze slipping under the door, cold and thin, whispering secrets from the street. He shifted slightly, arms tucked under his chin. The floor was cool against his cheek. His thoughts wandered, slow and small. He thought of the curtain that had burned, of the knight who paid with silver lies, of the old man who told a story with tears in his throat, of the spoon still hidden behind the bar, of the rats, hundreds maybe, with families and tunnels, and rules no human would ever know. And he thought of himself, not with sadness, not with pride, just thought, a boy, not sleeping, a mop, resting, a room holding its breath. At some point, he closed his eyes, but not fully, just enough to let the shadows soften, to let the sound of small feet become rhythm, to let the tavern's silence press down like a blanket, heavy but not cruel. He didn't need dreams tonight. The room was enough. It held him like old hands. It asked nothing, expected nothing, only that he lie still and listen. Still here, little one? Then listen too. This is the hour that belongs to no one, the in-between, the held breath, the echo that waits. No stories are told at this hour, but stories remember, and they settle in the dust, and in the cracks, and in the soft, tired heart of a boy who learned to keep watch even after the world went to sleep. Sleep now if you can. The rats won't mind. The echoes won't wake you. And the boy, if he's still awake, will make sure the fire doesn't go out. It had been threatening all day. The kind of sky that sat too low, heavy with something it didn't want to drop just yet. Gray and still, like an old man deciding whether to speak or stay silent. The boy had felt it in his bones before the first drop ever fell. His joints ached a little more. The air inside the tavern was thicker. Even the mug seemed heavier. The regulars grumbled more than usual. Mrs. Drabble burned the stew twice. The fire sputtered with damp logs that hissed, but wouldn't catch. Then, just after sunset, the rain began. It didn't knock gently. It slammed, like 1,000 tiny fists on the roof. The kind of rain that soaked you before you realized you'd stepped outside. The kind that found every crack in every ceiling, no matter how small. And this roof, old, patched, tired, had more cracks than courage. The first leak began above the pantry, a soft plink on the stone, then one near the firewood pile, then, suddenly, the infamous drip over table 5. Always the same spot, always the same rhythm. Plink, pause, plink. The boy fetched the first bucket before Mrs. Drabble even asked. She was already upstairs, dragging down the old copper basin they used for winter baths. By the time he returned, there were 3 leaks, then 5, then one near the bar, right over the shelf where the clean mugs sat. "Move those mugs," she shouted, "unless you like your ale pre-diluted." He moved them, fast. Then came the towels, old sacks, torn cloth, a wool blanket. No one remembered owning, all spread across the floor like patchwork islands in a rising sea. Still listening, little dreamer? Or has the sound of rain already wrapped you in sleep? That's all right. Santa will keep speaking, slow and low, like the water running down the beams. The boy stepped carefully now. The floor was slick in places, and cold. The wind slipped through the frame like fingers. Some customers left early. Others stayed longer, as if watching someone else's misfortune made the ale taste better. Mrs. Drabble moved between tables with her sleeves rolled and her patience thin. "You'd think," she muttered to no one in particular, "that the sky had a grudge against my roof?" A man at table 6 raised his mug and said, "Maybe it's jealous of your stew." She didn't laugh. Neither did the boy. He was on his hands and knees, sopping up a spill that wasn't ale. One bucket had tipped when someone kicked it. The water had spread fast, soaking through the edge of the tablecloth and into the boy's sleeves. "Use the dry rags," Mrs. Drabble called. He looked around. There were no dry rags left, only a pile of damp ones already brown with footstep marks and spilled stew. She saw him hesitate. "Your shirt, then. You're soaked anyway." He stared. She wasn't joking. He peeled off his outer layer, a linen overshirt already damp at the hem, and pressed it into the puddle. It made a sloppy, wet sound that echoed louder than it should have. A couple of customers glanced over. One laughed. The boy didn't look up. He kept wiping, sleeve after sleeve, folded, pressed, wrung. The wood drank it all and asked for more. By the time the floor was passable again, his shirt clung to him like seaweed. His skin was goose flesh. His hair dripped. Mrs. Drabble handed him a crust of bread. Not warm, not dry, but food. "Go sit by the fire," she said, less like an order, more like a surrender. He did. Sat near the hearth, now barely more than coals. Lord Reginald watched him from the bench, eyes slitted. The rain kept coming. Through the roof, through the cracks, through everything. Buckets filled, towels soaked. But they kept going, because what else could they do? This was not the kind of place you fixed. It was the kind you endured. Later, after the guests had gone and the buckets stood like silent guards at every corner, Mrs. Drabble walked the floor with a candle and her ledger. She counted the mugs, the tips, the damage. She muttered. She sighed. Then she sat beside him near the fire. "There was a time," she said, "when I thought I'd put in a whole new roof. Cedar, slanted, proper drainage. Then the war came. Then the tax man. Then the floorboards cracked." She looked up. "And here we are, catching the sky in soup pots." The boy didn't reply. She didn't expect him to. The rain softened for a moment, then came harder again, like breath. In, out, in, out. "You did good tonight," she added, "even if you smell like stew and rat water." He almost smiled. Almost. The fire gave one last sigh, then stilled. The tavern exhaled, and in the soft drip of water into buckets, the world grew quiet. "Still awake, little one? Let the sound of rain lull you. Let the cold stay outside. Let the roof, cracked though it may be, hold just long enough for morning. And if it doesn't, we'll put another bucket down. That's what we do." He wasn't like the others. You could tell the moment he stepped inside, the way the door seemed to open differently for him, even though the hinges still groaned. His boots didn't scuff the floor. His cloak, dark green velvet, lined, in satin, didn't smell of smoke or wet wool. It smelled like lavender soap and rain that fell over stone courtyards far from here. The tavern quieted when he entered, not from fear, but from something else. Curiosity, maybe, or disbelief. A nobleman here, in a place where the mugs were chipped and the stew had bones? But there he stood, gloves in hand, chin high, as if the warped wooden floor had been waiting to receive him. Mrs. Drabble gave him a long look. Not hostile, not impressed, just measuring. "Welcome," she said. He nodded once. "A drink, please. Red wine if you have it." She didn't, but she poured him something dark enough to pass. He took it delicately and chose the seat, by the fire without asking. He didn't look around much, just sat, legs crossed, one boot polished to a dull gleam, and sipped. The boy watched him from the side, mop still in hand. Something about the man didn't sit right. Too quiet, too still. Like furniture moved from one room into another where it didn't belong. His rings were gold, his hands soft, his eyes cold, unreadable. Still listening, little dreamer? This is not a tale of cruelty. Not loud cruelty, at least. This is the quieter kind. The kind that forgets to see people who scrub floors. The nobleman didn't speak to anyone else. Not the men playing dice. Not the woman humming near the bar. Not even Mrs. Drabble when she passed to poke the fire. He sat and drank, and when the glass was half full, he held it up to the light and frowned. Cloudy, he said softly, but tolerable. He swirled the drink, stared into it, and then, without warning, slammed the glass down. It didn't survive. The stem snapped, the bowl shattered. A fine spray of wine and shards spread across the table and onto the floor. The tavern stopped. Even the cat lifted his head. The nobleman stood, pulled out a handkerchief, embroidered, pristine, and dabbed his fingers. "Apologies," he said. "Faulty glassware." Then he turned to go. Just like that. Not angry, not ashamed. Just done. "Payment?" Mrs. Drabble asked, her tone flat. He paused by the door, reached into his coat, pulled out a coin that gleamed like polished moonlight and flicked it onto the counter without looking. Then he was gone. The door closed gently behind him. The room stayed quiet. Mrs. Drabble didn't move. She didn't touch the coin. The boy looked at the mess. Wine dark as blood, shards sharp as gilt. She nodded once. He understood. He knelt and began gathering the pieces, one by one. Slow, careful. Some were too small to see. He had to feel for them, fingertips brushing the grain of the wood, pausing when something bit back. One shard nicked his palm. He sucked in his breath, wiped the blood on his trouser leg, and kept going. The wine had soaked into the floor already. The wood would carry that mark for days, maybe weeks. Some stains don't care how hard you scrub. They stay because someone wanted to leave fast enough not to see them set in. He cleaned until the table shone and the floor was safe again. Then he sat by the fire, hands damp, heart quiet. "You all right?" Mrs. Drabble asked from behind the bar. He nodded. She didn't press. She knew the kind of hurt that didn't need speaking. Lord Reginald jumped up beside him, circled once, then settled, warm weight against the boy's thigh. The fire cracked softly. Someone at the back resumed their game. Dice tumbled. A chair creaked. Life continued. But in that one quiet spot by the hearth, something lingered. Not the nobleman himself. He was gone. Already stepping into another room somewhere with fresh wine and clean glass. But his absence left a shape. A lesson about glass and people and the way some things break too quietly to notice until you're the one holding the broom. Still, awake, little one? Then let this story rest beside you. Not sharp, not bitter, just true. Some guests leave behind more than coins. They leave weight, and if you carry it gently, like the boy did with every shard, it won't cut. Not forever. There was a moment, just one, when the tavern finally exhaled. No shouting, no spilled drinks, no barked orders, no rain leaking through the roof, no broken glass, no songs sung off key. The floor was dry, the stools were turned. The fire still burned low and soft, like it knew the boy was watching. And for once, no one was watching him. He wasn't wiping anything. Wasn't fetching, folding, or carrying. He wasn't being told what to do or where to stand. He was just sitting by the hearth, one leg tucked under the other, back slightly, hunched, hands resting in his lap. The bench was warm, the stone floor not yet cold. His shirt was clean or clean enough. He didn't plan to sit. It just happened, like the fire had pulled him down beside it, like gravity got gentler for a minute. Mrs. Drabble had gone upstairs an hour ago. She hadn't yelled. She'd just said, "That'll do." And he'd nodded. He hadn't moved since. Still awake, little dreamer? Let this chapter be the quiet between storms, Let it rest beside you like heat from the last log on the fire. The flames made no fuss tonight. No dancing too high, no popping sap, just a steady, pulsing glow that cast long shadows and warmed the boy's cheek. He turned slightly to face it, not for heat, but for comfort. Fires didn't ask questions. They just offered themselves. Around him, the tavern sighed in its own way. The ceiling beams groaned gently, stretching after a long day. A shutter outside clicked against its frame in a lazy rhythm. Somewhere in the pantry, a mouse scurried. Not urgently, just passing through. Even the mop, propped in the corner, looked content, as if it too had earned a moment. The boy didn't think about anything important. Not really. His mind wandered. The way steam rose, aimless and quiet. He noticed the way the firelight caught the rim of a mug left behind. The way the cat's tail flicked once, then stilled. Lord Reginald was nearby, curled on the other end of the bench, one eye half open, keeping company without trying too hard. The boy didn't pet him, didn't reach. The closeness was enough. He leaned his head against the stone wall, cool at first, then warmer as he settled. His eyes stayed open, but unfocused. He wasn't tired in the usual way, not sleepy, just still. A kind of rest that didn't need closing your eyes. A kind that rarely came. That's what made it special. The tavern had seen many kinds of moments, loud, frantic, angry, joyful. But rarely this. The kind of silence that didn't feel empty. The kind that felt earned. He thought about nothing. And in that nothing, everything softened. His shoulders, always tight, lowered. His breath slowed. His fingers unclenched. If someone had spoken then, he might have cried. Not because he was sad, but because the quiet had finally settled deep enough to let everything else rise. But no one spoke, and so he stayed. Just a boy, by a fire. In a room that, for once, didn't need him. Still listening, little one? Or are your eyes heavy like his were? If so, it's all right. This story isn't here to keep you awake. It's here to sit beside you while you drift. Like the fire did. Like the boy did. Like the night did. The embers pulsed gently, casting soft shadows across the floor. The world outside was wind and cold. But inside, for now, was safe. Not perfect, not bright, but safe. Lord Reginald stretched once, yawned without sound, and nestled back into the folds of the old cushion. The boy watched the last flicker of flame rise, curl, and disappear. Then finally he laid his head on his arm. Not to sleep, not quite, just to feel the warmth against his cheek. He whispered something to the fire, not words, just a breath. A thank you, perhaps, or a good night. And then he closed his eyes. The tavern didn't move. It held its breath with him. Outside, the wind softened. The stars blinked through clouds. And inside, by the hearth, a boy and a cat shared one moment. Quiet. Still. Enough. It always ended the same way. Not with applause, not with a bang. Just a slow fade, like a candle running out of wax. One guest, one chair, one last mug drained down to its silence. Tonight, it was a man who had spoken less than most. Gray coat, patched sleeves, a coin he held too tightly for too long. He had nursed a single drink like it was something holy, stared into the fire like it might answer a question he'd never dared ask. Now he stood, slowly. Boots scuffed the floor. No one said goodbye. No one ever did. He nodded at Mrs. Drabble, who responded with the same nod she'd given 1,000 times before. Not rude, not warm, just honest. The man pulled his cap down, adjusted his coat, and walked toward the door. The boy watched him go. Not because he was curious, but because the moment mattered. The last guest leaving was the turning of a page. The signal that the night had changed shape, from tavern to hollow, from voices to memory. The door creaked. A gust slipped in, sharp and damp. Then the door closed, and it was done. Still awake, little listener? Then let Santa speak softly now, for this is the part of the story made of echoes. Mrs. Drabble moved behind the bar with the weight of someone who knew what came next. She opened the ledger, counted coins. Most were copper, a few silver, one bent, one sticky. Not bad, she muttered. The boy began clearing. He didn't need telling. He never did. One mug left near the hearth, another behind the dice table. A crumpled cloth used to wipe hands after bread and stew. The crumbs, so many crumbs, were everywhere. He swept them carefully, not because they mattered, but because they were there. Leftovers of laughter, flecks of conversations half finished. He wiped the tables slowly, not for cleanliness, for closure. The room smelled of ash and ale and the faint tang of onion. Lord. Reginald jumped down from the bench and padded silently across the room, tail high, as if inspecting. He paused near a stool, sniffed it, and sat. His work was done, too. Mrs. Drabble sighed, closed the ledger. "Same again tomorrow," she said. The boy nodded. She looked at him, really looked, then tossed him the heel of a loaf. "You've earned the soft part." That was rare. He caught it, surprised. Bit into it slowly. Still warm. The tavern was quiet now. Not silent. Quiet. The kind of quiet that filled spaces like water. It pooled in corners, settled in beams, wrapped around the boy's shoulders like something that both weighed and warmed. He crouched to pick up the last few bits of crust beneath a table. A spoon someone had dropped and not noticed. A coin, copper, thin, worn, so light it felt like paper. He held it for a second, pocketed it without thinking. The fire crackled once, soft and low. He turned one stool upside down, then another. The chairs stacked like bones into rest. Mrs. Drabble wiped her hands and headed upstairs. "Lock the door," she called, "and don't forget the latch this time." He wouldn't. He never did. The boy stood in the middle of the room for a long time after she left. Not moving, not thinking, just being there, with the tables, the crumbs, the weight of goodbye. Then, slowly, he walked to the door, turned the lock, slipped the wooden bar across. The wind tapped once, then gave up. He returned to the hearth, sat on the floor. The heat still lived there, faint but faithful. He chewed the last of the bread. It stuck to his teeth, sweet, heavy. He stared into the flames, such as they were, small now, glowing red and gold like tired stars. He laid his hand on the warm stone, closed his eyes, and then, without thinking, he wished for something. He didn't say it aloud, not even to himself, just held it in the middle of his chest like a stone warmed in a pocket. A wish to be elsewhere, not forever, just one night, somewhere with stars, with silence that didn't ache, with soft sheets and no rag in his hand. And maybe, just maybe, someone waiting to ask him something simple, like, "Are you tired?" He opened his eyes. The fire blinked back. The crumbs were gone. The mugs were clean. The tavern was breathing its slow wooden breath. The last guest had left. And the night, as always, had stayed behind. Still awake, dear one? Or drifting like the boy is now? Either way, let this be enough. The room is still. The fire is low. The last guest has gone. And here, in the hush that follows, dreams begin. The fire had died hours ago. Only a few dull embers remained, buried under soft gray ash. But the warmth lingered, barely, just enough to make the stone floor less cruel. The boy lay close, arms curled under his chin, knees tucked to his chest. His coat, thin, patched, frayed at every edge, was pulled tight over his shoulders. One sleeve was damp from mopping earlier. The other had a rip near the elbow. His boots had been removed, turned sideways beside the hearth to dry, though. No one had asked why one sole was separating. His socks were mismatched. One had a hole near the toe. Still, he slept, or tried to. Still awake, little dreamer. If so, lie close beside him now. You won't wake him. He's deeper than that. Deeper than chores and floors and shouted orders. Deeper than broken mugs and dripping ceilings. Tonight, the world outside him is fading, and another is beginning. His breath is slow, his body heavy. But inside, somewhere behind closed eyes and soot-smudged cheeks, a window has opened. A window not in this tavern, not in York, not even in this century. In his dream, he's somewhere else, somewhere higher, wider, quieter. There is snow, not the hard, wet kind that melts into your socks, but soft flakes falling like feathers, like someone is shaking down the sky for fun. They don't sting his face. They kiss it. He walks without slipping, without fear. He's not carrying a bucket, not wiping anything. His hands are bare. They don't ache. And ahead, in a field of snow under stars brighter than any candle, there is a small house. Its windows glow golden. Smoke curls from a chimney. And standing outside, waiting, is a man with a red coat, a long white beard, a smile like winter forgot how to be cold. "You made it," the man says. The boy blinks. "Where is this?" "Somewhere better," says the man. "Just for tonight." "Am I allowed?" the boy asks. The man kneels, looks him in the eye. "You don't need to be allowed. You just need to be tired." The boy is so tired. And when the man opens the door, he sees shelves, hundreds of them, all filled with books, real ones, not menus, not ledgers, not beer-stained song sheets, but stories, real stories, with dragons and storms and cities that float. The boy steps inside. There is a fire, a proper one, roaring but kind. A chair too big, stuffed with pillows. A blanket softer than bread crusts. "Sit," the man says. "I'll read." And so the boy does. He listens. And in the dream, the story is not about lords or knights or princesses. It's about someone who wipes tables, someone who scrubs floors, someone who never gets asked what they want. And by the end, that someone is the one who saves everything, not with swords, not with spells, but with knowing, with seeing, with being the only one who stayed behind long enough to notice what was really broken. The boy listens and cries a little, not because he's sad, but because the story is kind, because it remembers someone like him. And when the story ends, the man closes the book. "Same time tomorrow?" he asks. The boy wants to say yes, but the dream is already softening, the room fading, the snow drifting up instead of down. And the stars. Oh, the stars. They're coming closer. Not to blind him, but to cover him, like a second blanket made of light. Back in the tavern, his breath rises once, then settles. His hand shifts under his cheek. A soft snore, no louder, then a sigh. Lord Reginald, curled near the cold hearth, opens one eye, watches him, just for a moment, then sleeps again. The tavern creaks, the beams stretch, the last coal gives its last glow, and in that hush, under a blanket patched with thread and hope, a boy sleeps near the ashes and dreams of the stars. Still listening, little one? Then close your eyes now. The night is done. The floor is clean. The room is quiet. And the story, for now, is complete.